This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link below. More about them in a bit. It was the site of one of World War II's worst atrocities. In April 1942, a combined American and Filipino force surrendered to the advancing Japanese. By now, they'd held out for 99 days, holding the Bataan Peninsula despite a lack of food and medicine. Despite, too, scorching temperatures and sickening humidity. Broken, exhausted, their commanders assumed an official surrender would save lives. How wrong they were. Unprepared for dealing with so many POWs, the Japanese herded their new prisoners on foot to a train depot some 106 kilometers away. Known as the Bataan Death March, the 10-day walk was famously brutal, a walk in which men were shot for stopping to drink water or beheaded for slowing down. Incredibly, though, this was just the beginning. It was only afterwards that the real horror began. Interned in Camp O'Donnell, the Allied troops lived through one of the grimmest POW experiences of World War II. Ravaged by disease and starvation, men dropped like flies in numbers dwarfing those of the Death March itself. Today, we're going to uncover the dark history of Camp O'Donnell, one of Japan's deadliest POW camps. It's safe to say that none of those working on its construction had any idea of the horrific things that would take place in Camp O'Donnell, a 250-hectare site lying 150 kilometers north of Manila in the Philippines. The camp had been founded only in mid-1941 as a place to house the 71st Philippine Infantry Division. It had been a tense year. War was raging in Europe, and there were growing fears that America and its Filipino colony might get sucked in. Closer to home, the Japanese Imperial Army were rampaging across parts of Asia, fighting a brutal war of annihilation in China, even as they looked to expand their empire further. Given all that, many of those stationed in the area around Manila Bay assumed war might well be coming, that they might be called upon to defend the Commonwealth of the Philippines. Hence, projects like Camp O'Donnell, overseen by US Army engineers, projects that would help train the Filipino Army up to elite standard. Not that anyone seriously thought such training was necessary. Manila and its surrounding areas were home in 1941 to not just tens of thousands of Filipino reservists, but also some 22,000 American troops. Testimony taken after the war paints a picture of young men certain they'd be able to repel any attack, that their numbers, combined with superior American equipment, effectively made them invincible. It was a feeling shared by those at the top, men like General Douglas MacArthur, who believed the US garrison could hold back any invasion. It would only be after their defeat that the hidden issues plaguing the military became painfully clear. The American troops had no combat experience, and many were raw, young recruits. The Filipinos suffered from equipment shortages and were often severely undertrained. Yet, as the first Japanese planes appeared over the horizon on December 8, 1941, mere hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, no one had yet clicked what an utter disaster the coming battle was going to be. The bombardment of Manila announced the arrival of war in the Philippines. From the moment the first explosions rang out, those building Camp O'Donnell were removed from their duties. They were sent scrambling south to help protect against the invasion. On December the 22nd, the main Japanese force landed on the island, 43 highly trained soldiers from the 14th Army under the command of Masaru Homma. Yet when MacArthur telegrammed President Franklin Roosevelt, it wasn't to tell him, "Holy crap, we're screwed," but to declare that his garrison would hold. Aside from the numerical advantage, you see, MacArthur also had a backup plan, a defensible 48-kilometer strip of land across the bay from Manila. Known as the Bataan Peninsula, it was narrow, a mere 24 kilometers across, with a range of mountains from where troops could rain death on the attacking Japanese. As early as the beginning of January 1942, MacArthur concentrated forces on the easily defended strip. But rather than a fight back, those men were unwittingly preparing their last stand. Prior to invasion, no logistical plans had been made for a fighting retreat. Now, as the Allied forces dropped back onto the peninsula, they left behind staggering amounts of food and ammunition. Food and ammunition they kind of urgently needed in order to stay alive. The result was the American and Filipino forces began the Battle of Bataan on half rations, without any air cover or hope of reinforcements. Oh, and also because this was the tropics, many of them were also fighting while suffering from the effects of malaria or dengue fever, because it's not like facing the Japanese Imperial Army was already awful enough. Yet, despite all of the scrubs, the Allied defense was the stuff of legend. For 99 days, these raw American recruits and under-equipped Filipinos held back the advancing army, despite constant bombardment, despite endless hardship. they made a stand. To use an extremely recent analogy, this was the World War II equivalent of the defense of Mariupol, an outgunned force holding out way longer than their attackers predicted. Sadly, though, longer than predicted isn't the same as forever. As April dawned with fresh Japanese troops on the offensive, Ground Commander General Ned King realized that his men couldn't last. The disease and hunger were decimating his ranks. So, rather than see the suffering continue, he opted for a surrender, one formally announced at 12:30 p.m. on April 9, 1942. But it turned out that General King had badly misjudged his adversary. Rather than save lives, the surrender at Bataan would instead fate tens of thousands of soldiers to the worst kinds of death imaginable. The surrender of Bataan's 76,000 defenders remains to this day the largest force to ever raise the white flag under US command. In fact, it was so large that the Japanese had no idea what to do with it. All those old war movie cliches about Japanese soldiers committing suicide rather than surrendering, well, they contained a great big dollop of truth, one that meant Imperial commanders simply hadn't prepared for dealing with so many prisoners. This could have been a recipe for disaster, even if the Imperial Army was the gentlest fighting force on the planet, one dedicated to treating POWs with decency and respect. Unfortunately for everybody captured, respect and decency were the last thing on the soldiers' minds. The atrocities started from the moment of surrender. Up to 400 Filipino officers were the first to die, summarily executed as revenge for standing with the Americans. But while such needless death was chilling, the awful reality is that the dead were the lucky ones. The same day the surrender was sounded, the surviving Americans and Filipinos were herded down to the main road on Bataan's east coast. From there, they would be force-marched up to a rail junction known as San Fernando for onward travel to POW camps. It's this walk north that would become known as the Bataan Death March, although it was far from a uniform experience. Because Allied forces had been spread over the peninsula when they surrendered, distances of travel varied wildly. Some, further to the north, would wind up walking a relatively modest 5 days in the searing tropical heat. Others, who'd surrendered at Mariveles, would be forced to endure grueling hikes of a week and a half. But whether they suffered the entire 106-kilometer ordeal or just part of it, there was one thing all the men involved could agree on. The Bataan Death March was a walk through hell itself. The first issue was the climate, a tropical soup of burning sun and swampy humidity with air so thick it was like breathing in treacle. You know that old saying, only mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun? Well, the Japanese treated their captives worse than rabid dogs, making them march through the suffocating noon heat, forbidding them from wearing hats or lingering in the shade for even a moment. This would have been punishing even if the prisoners were fit and rested, but they were coming off the back of an exhausting 99-day battle, and many were badly sick. Dysentery was sweeping through the ranks like a particularly disgusting wildfire. If you've ever had Norovirus, also known as the winter vomiting bug, you'll know how hard it is to even make it to the bathroom while constantly spewing. Dysentery comes from both ends and is about 100 times worse, and the infected men weren't just trying to do the bathroom dash. They were on a forced march, one in which they needed to keep up a certain pace or face the consequences. And this being the Imperial Army, the consequences were extreme. If a prisoner broke ranks, he could be shot. If he fell behind, he might be bayoneted to death. If he simply collapsed from exhaustion, Japanese tanks would run over him, crushing him beneath their wheels. March survivor Major Richard Gordon described some of the horrors in a 1999 interview. Each night, we were placed in a field and allowed to fend for ourselves. We expected water, if not food, but received neither. When dawn broke and we were put back on the road, a number of bodies were always left behind, littering our sleeping field. In some ways, they were the lucky ones. Other survivors report seeing those unable to get up in the morning simply thrown in ditches, buried alive. To add insult to literal injury, the Japanese soldiers often beat the healthier prisoners just for sport, or bayoneted them, or beheaded them. There was no reason, other than they felt like it. The official death toll for the Bataan Death March is 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans, but scores of people remain unaccounted for. All we know is that of the 76,000 who surrendered, only 54,000 reached their final destination. Yet even reaching San Fernando offered no respite. At the station, POWs were herded into suffocating boxcars so tightly that no one could sit and no air could circulate. During the 4-hour journey to Capas, untold numbers died standing up. The survivors then had to walk another 11 kilometers in the punishing heat before at long last reaching the end of their march. But the end of the march was not the end of their ordeal. Now the real nightmare could begin. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a minute, but first, here's a word from today's video sponsor, Squarespace. You know what's nice about summer? Bit of time off, rest, and relaxation. It's also a perfect time to spend a little time daydreaming about that next project you want to start. I, myself, just got back from holiday, and as always, kind of thinking about work a little bit, thinking about the next project I want to work on. Anyway, Squarespace gives you every possible tool you might want to start your next web project, whether it's a small business, a sports blog, a creation portfolio, or just a page of memes. Whatever you like to make, you can do it with Squarespace. Are you looking to get in and out quick without thinking too much about what your website should look like? Well, use one of their beautiful templates. Or if you're more of a hands-on person, Squarespace is super customizable, so you can also, start a bit more from scratch and make it look exactly like you want. Once you're done setting up your website, tinkering with the design if you're so inclined, or maybe just playing with the colors, there's tons of extra features: email campaigns, patronage portals, social integrations, member-only areas, analytics, commercial options, 24/7 customer support. Everything you need is in one place. So when you're ready to get started on the next web project of yours, big or small, if it involves a website, do it with Squarespace. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch your new site, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. After fighting together, marching together, and dying together, the first thing American and Filipino soldiers reaching Camp O'Donnell discovered was that their shared journey was over. In the months since they'd driven the defenders onto the Bataan Peninsula, the Japanese had been reworking the unfinished training camp into a divided prison. Separate sections existed for Americans and Filipinos, with the Japanese guardhouses acting as a sealed border running down the middle. As they staggered toward the entrance, the POWs were pointed to different gates according to their race. But while they would suffer separately, Filipinos and Americans would absolutely both suffer. From arrival, new prisoners moved through a system designed to run like miserable clockwork, each new humiliation a mocking chime of despair. Strike one was the compulsory search. Every new arrival had their possessions confiscated, including things like blankets and raincoats, and their bodies were thoroughly checked. Anyone caught in possession of anything Japanese, even a single yen, was summarily executed on the false assumption that they'd looted the item from the dead Imperial army soldiers. Those that survived this clearing process were then put into a group, ushered into the main compound, and made to stand at attention for the welcome speech. Today, the term welcome speech gives the impression of the sort of gently boring greeting you might get at a new office job. But that's not what the sadistic captain, Yoshio Tsuneyoshi, had in mind. A 51-year-old reservist, Tsuneyoshi had once been a middle manager type in an office, and he absolutely confirmed everyone's secret suspicions about evil bosses. Under the sun's unrelenting inferno, Tsuneyoshi would shout and curse at the arrivals for 2 whole hours, striding back and forth with a samurai sword, telling them that they should have killed themselves rather than be captured. Remember, these are guys who were already dehydrated, hungry, badly sick, and exhausted from a 10-day hike. By making them stand in direct sunlight for hours, Tsuneyoshi all but assured that some of them would die. In some instances, he even broke off his speech to sit in the shade and eat lunch, forcing the men to keep standing as he did so. And woe betide any man trying to help a comrade who collapsed. Having proved himself the most important man in his pathetic little world, Tsuneyoshi would at last allow the survivors to enter the camp proper, at which point it became clear there wasn't really any camp to speak of. Building work at O'Donnell had lasted just a handful of months before the Japanese invasion halted it. As such, few barracks had actually been built. Those that had were often unfinished, missing a roof or windows, with nothing but dirt for floors. In their place, scores of bamboo poles had been driven into the ground, with palms laid across their tops. It was under these that most prisoners slept. The result was POWs sleeping not just exposed to the elements, but to the thick curtains of disease-carrying mosquitoes that swarmed day and night. Yet no matter how sick the men got, they did their level best to avoid the hospital. One of Camp O'Donnell's few permanent structures, the hospital, had evidently been named by the same person responsible for Airstrip 1's Ministry of Love. Lacking beds, it was nothing more than a glorified waiting room for death. Not that the wait was ever long. All but ignored by the Japanese, the patients were the sickest of the sick. Unable to move, to clean themselves, they simply lay in their own waste until the Grim Reaper carried them away. In the American hospital, dozens died every day. In the Philippine section, it's thought 350 might have expired on a daily basis. So bad was the overcrowding, and so poor was the sanitation. As one allied doctor who witnessed the camp hospital later wrote, "If the angel of death ever had a cauldron of victims ready for him, it was in O'Donnell." So, hopefully, we've established by now that life in Camp O'Donnell sucked. But what was it really like there? If you were a captive under the odious Captain Tsuneyoshi, what would have your daily experience been like? Well, perhaps the first thing to note is that routine life in the camp was exceptionally boring. While some were seconded to work crews and sent out as slave labour, many more were simply stuck within the rusted wire fences, and that meant spending ungodly amounts of time waiting for water. O'Donnell, you see, had no natural supply of water. I mean, sure, there was the creek, but the latrines emptied right into it. Flies laid eggs in it, slugs lived in it, and, well, good luck surviving a mouthful of it. No, the only way to ensure enough water to survive the heat was to visit one of the handful of spigots from which you were allowed to refill your canteen once a day. Thanks to severe overcrowding, even that one refill necessitated standing in line for hours upon hours in the tropical heat, waiting to get just enough water to continue your painful existence. Technically, this water was also meant to be for washing, but with dehydration such a problem, few used it for anything but survival, meaning your body might be caked with dirt. Another constant was the sensation of hunger. Although the Japanese fed their captives 3 meals a day, they weren't meals anyone not in a prison camp would ever eat. A porridge like mush, the dish lu gao was frequently made from rice that was mouldy or had been infested with weevils. On good days, this concentrated dose of culinary hate might come with a tiny bit of fish. On bad days, the cooks might bulk it out with dust and pebbles scraped straight from the ground. But you would probably eat it, all of it, because you had no choice. Because you only had to look around you to see what happened to those who didn't eat. As the weeks passed at the camp, the number of men still capable of carrying out basic duties shrank. This happened until there weren't even enough people to act as grave diggers. This meant corpses being left out in the sun, scores of American dead, and literally hundreds of Filipinos abandoned to nature. And in the tropics, a body in the sun has only one outcome: insects. Lots and lots of insects. In his book, Fire and Fortitude, the US Army and the Pacific War, the historian John C. McManus included eyewitness testimony from survivor Jack Brady, who remembered the constant drone of flies. Quote, "They were so damn thick. At night they'd sit down on the roofs, and because there were so many of them, whole patches of thatch would fall down. Nowhere, absolutely nowhere, could you get away from those damn flies." For these buzzing insects, Camp O'Donnell's unburied corpses overflowing latrines and unclean hospital were like an all-day Las Vegas buffet. But for the humans trapped there, the arrival of the flies only added an extra layer of misery. An endless drone of noise, the sensation of creatures crawling on you, gleefully waiting for you too, to become their food. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many lost their will to live. They stopped standing in line for the spigots or eating their mouldy food, and they just waited for the inevitable. Yet exactly how many died remains unknown. All death tolls we have associated with Camp O'Donnell are just educated guesswork, with some estimating that 1 in 6 interred there died, and others perhaps as many as 1 in 3. Bearing in mind the death rate of American troops in Nazi POW camps was around 3%, that's an eye-watering figure. And it gets worse when you put numbers on it. Our best guesses suggest that some 1,500 Americans and perhaps as many as 26,000 Filipinos died in the camp. They were carried away by malaria, dysentery, dehydration, exhaustion, malnutrition, or some dreadful combination of the lot. That means O'Donnell was even deadlier than the death march that preceded it. Thankfully, though, it wouldn't be around much longer. Perhaps the main reason Camp O'Donnell's death rate wasn't much higher was that it only functioned for a handful of months. Of that handful, only 3 or so were spent suffering the severe overcrowding that turned it into a death trap. As early as late March 1942, the Japanese were already transferring the surviving American prisoners onwards. Now, this wasn't out of some humane desire to alleviate the horrors of the camp. Red Cross volunteers had turned up during the worst of this period, offering medicine and supplies, only to be turned away by Captain Tsuneyoshi. No, one of the main reasons operations wound down were a desire to separate the Filipinos and Americans permanently. In the Imperial Japanese vision for Asia, Filipinos had important work to do laboring as Tokyo's slaves, hence the mass pardoning and conditional release of Camp O'Donnell's remaining Filipino prisoners that October. The Americans, by contrast, were just an annoyance to deal with. So on they were sent to prison camps around Cabanatuan, where thousands more died. Or onto the hell ships bound for Japan itself, so called because of the sheer number of prisoners who perished en route, with the survivors becoming slave laborers for major companies. As the camp's population slowly dropped, the situation became more tolerable. By the 21st of July, it was reported with pride that fewer than 100 people were now dying per day. It was shortly before this milestone was reached that a strange thing happened. One evil, humid afternoon in June, a guard with the somewhat racist nickname Banjo Eyes went over to the Americans and dumped a sack of cement before them. To their surprise, the survivors were told that it was to be used to make a shrine to all the US personnel who died in the camp. In the end, they built a simple white cross, engraved with the words, "In memory of the American dead. O'Donnell War Personnel Enclosure, 1942. Known as the Sack of Cement Cross, it stood there for the next 45 years, a grim white reminder in a forgotten corner of the Philippines of the horrors once enacted on the nation's soil. Finally, on January the 20th, 1943, the Japanese closed the camp down, and so ended one of the grimmest stories of the war in the Pacific. Of course, though, it didn't end for those who'd lived through it. After O'Donnell, many prisoners were forced to spend another 3 years suffering before the war finally ended, by which time many more had died. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender, the US military held multiple trials over war crimes in the Philippines, including of Masaharu Homma, whose soldiers had perpetrated the Bataan Death March, and Captain Tsuneyoshi. While Homma was sentenced to death and executed, Tsuneyoshi was simply imprisoned. It goes without saying that the conditions of his confinement were like paradise compared to those that he oversaw in O'Donnell. Today, Camp O'Donnell, and especially the Bataan Death March that preceded it, are infamous, bywords for the atrocities committed in World War II's Pacific Theatre. Yet the sad truth is they were just one of a kaleidoscope of war crimes that took place in this era. Across the European and Pacific theatres, literally hundreds of lesser-known death marches unfolded, sometimes in the tropical heat, sometimes in the ice and snow. Other O'Donnells likewise swallowed up human lives, camps for Soviet POWs, for Chinese civilians, for Europe's Jews, for anyone on the wrong side of genocidal regimes battling the world. Recording this now, at a time when another brutal dictatorship is committing unspeakable crimes in the aid of its pathetic dreams of empire, it's tempting to wonder if we ever really learned the lessons of places like Camp O'Donnell, if we're really capable of understanding the horrors that unfolded here. Because in a sane world, not even the most brainwashed zealot should be able to hear about the crimes detailed in this video without vowing never again. Sadly though, our world isn't sane. There are too many Captain Tsuneyoshis out there, too many unwilling to learn the lessons of history. And if there's one thing that the grim story of Camp O'Donnell could teach us, it's that humankind is capable of staggering cruelty. Until we learn to remedy this, there will always be more places like it.